Story 1. So, everyone has a prenuptial agreement. If you don't create your own, you will receive whatever the law dictates, regardless of your preferences. Understand the rules, as there may be aspects that both parties dislike. Without proper documentation to address these concerns, you may find yourselves bound by them. Story 2. I see it the same way I see insurance. You do not want to actually have to use it, but it is a smart thing to have in order to protect yourself in case things do not go as you expect. Story 3. My wife and I are both attorneys. She made more money than I did and had more assets when we got married. She asked for a prenuptial agreement, and I agreed that she needed to be protected. We are approaching our 30-year wedding anniversary. Story 4. It is practical, especially if there is a significant amount of money involved and if it was acquired prior to the relationship. It is different if they supported their partner through difficult times before the wealth was obtained. Story 5. I think most people do not understand prenuptial agreements. If someone is bringing in enough wealth and feels the need to protect it, then they absolutely should. I am in for the long term, so either way, we will be dividing up some assets. Story 6. I am engaged and will not be getting a prenuptial agreement with my fiancé because we have equivalent assets and have been together for a decade. That said, if my fiancé wanted to proceed with one, and a lawyer reviewed it and deemed it fair, then I would not have any issues signing it. We love each other and should both feel comfortable that we are protected in our relationship. As a woman, if I lived in a more restrictive state that favored whichever partner remained in the workforce, I might consider a prenuptial agreement to ensure that if I take time off for children, I will be protected and have rights to our assets based on my contributions outside of income. Story 7. I wouldn't like being asked, but if I were marrying someone significantly wealthier than I am, I would understand. Fortunately, my wife and I are both in the same financial situation. Story 8. There are times when it is essential. Two friends of ours decided to get married. It's a second marriage for both, and both have children from their previous marriages. I encourage them to get a prenuptial agreement, if for no other reason than to protect the children's interests should one of them be in an accident or face an unexpected event. They created a prenuptial agreement, updated both of their wills, informed their former spouses, and kept everything transparent. They are happy, and I am sure they will grow old together, but sometimes you have to think of everyone around you. The last thing anyone wants to deal with if something unfortunate happens is a dispute over the estate. Story 9. It's like buying insurance for your marriage. Just in case things go wrong, you'll have a safety net. Additionally, consider all the money you'll save on attorney fees. Story 10. If I'm marrying someone wealthy, I would sign it. I'm not in it for his money, and I don't need his wealth. I also don't want to deal with an unbalanced relationship dynamic where he might hold his wealth over me. Story 11. There is always technically a prenuptial agreement. Either your government decides for you or you decide the conditions of separation, so you might as well. Story 12. Currently, I am finalizing my prenuptial agreement. For context, I have nearly 6 times her net worth. The reality is that nobody expects divorce, yet divorce happens. A prenuptial agreement makes divorce cheaper, as most of the disputes are already settled. The average prenuptial agreement costs approximately $2,000 to $10,000. The average divorce can cost as much as $100,000 or more. Story 13. Always have a prenuptial agreement and revise it as necessary as your situation changes. A marriage is more than a relationship. It is a legal and financial arrangement. The state will certainly treat it as such long after love has faded. When and if the relationship ends, both parties to that arrangement should have confidence in what will happen and that their interests will be protected. If you cannot approach it maturely, do not get married. Story 14. It is essential for me to establish a requirement. In the event of a divorce, someone must divide the assets. This can either be my partner and me making those decisions while the relationship is healthy, or it can be determined by the courts. I prefer the former option. Story 15. Any rational person knows that people can, unfortunately, fall out of love as time passes. Obviously, you wouldn't want to, but it's not something anyone is immune to. Sometimes, two people can actually love each other more than anyone else in the universe, but it's just not practical. Unfortunately, love isn't always enough. It's the mature thing to do. Story 16. I let my spouse know I would sign one if he wanted to, but as the wedding drew closer, he said never mind. It was his mother who was pressuring him to get one. She didn't trust me. My mother-in-law and I get along well now. She had cold feet, I guess. I think it depends on the financial circumstances whether it makes sense. It wasn't practical in our situation and instead demonstrated distrust. Sometimes it's the only way forward, for example, when people come together with inheritances dedicated to offspring. Story 17. Practical, sensible, and in everyone's interest, if they are mature enough. I still adore the woman I married. I despise the person she became. Story 18. It's both a practical decision and a cautionary measure until you can fully trust the relationship. It is preferable to establish that trust before marriage, but that is not always practical, especially when you are young and circumstances still have plenty of time to change. Story 19. It's no different from fastening a seatbelt. You aren't planning to have an accident, but you want to be prepared just in case. Story 20. I think it's a little odd to get a prenuptial agreement, but I find it even stranger to make a big deal out of it or refuse and get offended if someone asks you. It does make sense for some people. Story 21. I am completely comfortable with it. In fact, I believe partners should have open communication and written contracts regarding various aspects of life, including household responsibilities and raising children together or separately. These agreements should be reviewed regularly to ensure they still meet the needs of all parties involved. Greater clarity in areas that are often left ambiguous due to emotions can be beneficial in the long run. Story 22. Try to look at it from this angle. If you get married legally, you automatically sign a prenuptial agreement. This is the default one set by the government. In the past, the government established these laws to protect the traditional housewife from leaving with nothing. However, as most relationships now consist of two working adults who can usually manage financially by themselves, these laws are outdated, which is why many people opt for a custom prenuptial agreement. Story 23. I believe much of the stigma surrounding prenuptial agreements comes from a lack of understanding. A prenuptial agreement is not a contract stating, if we divorce, you get nothing. It should be fair to both parties. If someone understands this and is still entirely opposed to a prenuptial agreement, it raises questions about their intentions in the event of a divorce. Story 24. It is a practical and reasonable decision. My financial advisor's top piece of advice to me was, when you get married, please arrange a prenup. Of course, I hope to never use it and I trust my partner completely, but it's better to be safe than sorry. I have been hurt in the past by being blindsided in previous relationships, and life is unpredictable. Anything can happen, and anyone who thinks otherwise is quite naive. Story 25. There are many aspects of a relationship that are difficult to discuss. The longer you wait to address them, the harder it becomes. Story 26. Prenuptial agreements are like marriage insurance. Just as with home insurance, you hope your house doesn't burn down or get blown away by a tornado. However, if that does happen, having insurance is certainly advantageous. Story 27. It's disappointing, but if you're making serious life decisions about a partner and they can be easily affected by any serious discussion, you have larger issues. Trust works both ways. Story 28. It would depend entirely on the relationship and the location of the relationship. I've heard that my state doesn't tend to uphold prenuptial agreements, so having one drafted seems like it would be a waste. I haven't personally experienced this, but a couple of divorced coworkers have shared their experiences with me. If my partner had wanted a prenuptial agreement before we got married, it would have felt a bit unnecessary since I was in a better financial position, and I still am. However, I would have been open to considering one. If my partner were wealthy, I could understand wanting a prenuptial agreement to protect his assets. I've seen how people can change over time, so having added protection is just a good idea overall. Story 29. We signed one with my wife for a few reasons. 1. We do not know what the future holds for us, but we love each other. If we have to divorce for any reason, we wanted it to be clean and, for the sake of our child, avoid fighting over trivial matters like money or property. There was a significant imbalance in our financial situations prior to the wedding. She comes from a very wealthy family, while I come from a middle-class background. Therefore, I suggested creating a prenuptial agreement to demonstrate that I am not marrying her for her family's wealth, but because I love her. In the event of a possible divorce, this agreement alleviates the stress of potentially losing everything, allowing us to be honest about our feelings for each other and focus on open communication while exploring a path toward reconciliation. Aim for the best, plan for the worst. Story 30. The situation depends on the reasons for the prenuptial agreement and its fairness. Does it protect both parties? Or is it designed to benefit only one person while harming the other? Often, prenuptial agreements are created in bad faith, but they can also be beneficial if both parties are represented and assets are divided fairly. My cousin is an example of a prenuptial agreement made in bad faith. Her ex-husband owned a company and stated that he wanted her to marry him for love and not for his money. As a result, upon divorce, he kept everything while she retained nothing. He also insisted that she become a stay-at-home mother, forcing her to quit her only source of independent income. He cheated on her while she was pregnant. The stress likely contributed to her miscarriage, which he celebrated as one less loose end. He divorced her and essentially left her with nothing. My uncle drove for a full day to pick her up. She had no money, no savings, no car, no home, and nothing to her name. She didn't even have her baby. Story 31. I think it is incredibly smart to have a plan. You are preparing for the worst during a time when you love each other the most, making it more likely that you will be fair in theory. Someone explained it well. If you do end up divorced, you will likely have many other issues to argue about, so at least this way finances and assets are already handled. That is one less argument to have. Story 32. I believe a prenuptial agreement is the wise choice. Regardless of how much I love or trust someone, you can never predict what might happen in the future. Those who are offended by it often forget that it protects both individuals, not just one. Additionally, it enables you to determine asset distribution in the event of a divorce, while both parties remain calm and composed, allowing for mature decision-making. Attempting to resolve these issues during a period of conflict and resentment is simply a nightmare scenario. Story 33. It is a good, practical decision. It is also similar to insurance. In case something happens, it is wise to have it. You may not use it, but if an unusual situation occurs, you are covered. Story 34. I'm getting one because throughout my years as a single woman, I worked hard to ensure I could support myself. I bought my house and funded my retirement account. Now that I'm getting married, I wanted something in writing that verifies all of that is mine. Will I share it with my husband? Absolutely. It will contribute to our retirement together. But just in case, I have this protection. It makes me feel better. Story 35. The government's concept of marriage is essentially a prenuptial agreement, with the government establishing the terms. Writing your own prenuptial agreement allows the couple to set the terms rather than having the government do so. However, those terms often do not carry much weight. Therefore, bothering to write a prenuptial agreement can feel akin to getting a paternity test when your child is born. It reflects a lack of confidence in the marriage. Story 36. It's not that I distrust them. It's that I know people can change, especially over a long period, which marriages can last. Story 37. I see it as practical and we created one. People often associate prenuptial agreements with love and breakups, but consider a mental illness or a behavior-altering brain tumor. I had a case in the extended family where a partner experienced such challenges without doctors identifying a clear cause, which led to the person actively damaging the relationship. It's also about risk mitigation, especially if partners are self-employed. If things go wrong in any situation, it is at least helpful to know where responsibility lies. Story 38. Always do a prenuptial agreement. I have seen too many difficult divorces in my family to ever have any illusions about this. Story 39. Does everyone here singing the praises of a prenuptial agreement actually have one? The number I saw for the United States is 15% of married couples had them as of 2022. So if that's the case, those people are disproportionately represented in this comment section. My husband and I have always lived in community property states, and we have both always worked. Neither of us came into the marriage with any major assets. If our life situation were different, I could see it making sense, such as if either of us had children from a previous relationship or significant assets. As it is, it wouldn't make sense for us to both pay lawyers to plan for the division of assets that we have both equally contributed to. You cannot avoid losing half your assets with a prenuptial agreement if things are mostly equitable within your relationship. If a prenuptial agreement is not considered fair, it can easily be invalidated, from my understanding. Story 40. A prenuptial agreement is a mature and responsible recognition that even though two people love each other very much, they can grow apart, and sometimes it is in their best interest to separate. It is the understanding that in the moment there is no intention of divorcing, but not romanticizing the idea of happily ever after, and realizing that if they do last forever, it is something they will never need. However, if something does happen, both partners have taken steps to make the process easier. In essence, a prenuptial agreement allows a couple to say, "I love you and want to love you forever," but in the event that this does not happen, let us decide on a fair framework for distributing our assets while we are not emotionally charged and angry with each other. Sometimes the responsible thing to do is to remember we live in a non-fairy tale world and to take the necessary steps to ensure everyone is protected. Story 41. Straight up. Anyone wary of a prenuptial agreement is interested in the other person's money. It may not be the only reason, but someone else's money is certainly a factor in their decision to marry. Get your own lawyer, absolutely. Do not just sign anything on a whim. Prenuptial agreements are generally standard for most people. Story 42. People do not understand prenuptial agreements. It is not, if we get divorced you get nothing. It is more like, I owned these things before we got married, so if we get divorced, this is what I had to begin with, and we will divide everything else. Story 43. I believe it is a sign of distrust. I take marriage, including my own, very seriously. Having experienced how my siblings and I were affected by our parents' divorce, I wanted to be certain my marriage would last. If someone believes that divorce is even a possibility, I don't think they should get married. Therefore, I don't see any reason for a person to sign a prenuptial agreement. Story 44. According to the American Psychological Association, approximately 40 to 50% of first marriages end in divorce. The divorce rate for second marriages is even higher, with approximately 60 to 67% of second marriages ending in divorce. Those numbers do not lie. Would you trust half of your belongings to a coin flip? Story 45. If there is a significant gap in savings, salary, and assets, then a prenuptial agreement is essential for protecting yourself. In the event of a divorce, which we obviously hope to avoid but cannot predict, this agreement can facilitate a smoother process by clearly delineating what belongs to you versus what belongs to your spouse. People can change when money is involved, and sometimes you may not discover this until it is too late. Story 46. I completely understand. If someone has a lot of money in the bank, it makes sense for them to want to protect it. I think it is quite smart. I wouldn't complain about it personally. Story 47. Having been divorced, I still wish we had one. It would have meant I paid for fewer of my attorney's mortgages. Story 48. I want to make one simple point. Divorce is not an option. Only mediation is permitted if the marriage ends. Story 49. I think it is reasonable, though I did not bother. A prenuptial agreement should be made a requirement when you register to be married. It will save society as a whole significant money and heartache. Story 50. I fully support it. The reality is that half of marriages end in divorce, so you must acknowledge that reality. If one or both partners are entering the marriage with assets, it seems like an obvious choice. Story 51. It depends on the circumstances of the individuals at the time of the wedding. If one partner has significantly more assets than the other, a prenuptial agreement can protect against financial disparity in the event of a divorce. However, if both partners start on roughly equal footing, then any assets they acquire together should be split evenly. This matter is complex and should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Story 52. It is practical if you have significant assets or are wealthy. If you are below the poverty line and require a prenuptial agreement, I would be concerned about that relationship. Story 53. If our assets are evenly split at the time of marriage, I don't think a prenuptial agreement is necessary. However, if there is a significant disparity, it makes more sense for both sides. When my wife and I got married, we both had similar earning potential and no real assets. There wasn't a need for a prenuptial agreement, as anything we earned afterward would be an even split, and there was nothing to argue over going into the marriage. If one partner has millions while the other does not, it would be wise for both parties to protect themselves. Story 54. How important is your lifestyle if you have worked for an education and a career and made sound financial decisions? All the women I know who have married in the last 20 years have prenuptial agreements. It's an acknowledgement of reality. Otherwise, you are relying on hope. Story 55. Practical: if one of us is bankrupt, then they won't negatively impact the other partner. In my country, if married incorrectly, then his debt is my debt and vice versa. Items we purchase together are added to a separate contract or trust fund. Story 56. I view it as follows. Many marriages fail. I want my partner to continue choosing me and to take good care of me. If they no longer feel in love or for any other reason, I do not want to bear the burden of losing my financial security due to their mood. Story 57. It depends on various factors. If one partner already earns significantly more or has a retirement plan, then it may not be unreasonable. Trust is important in both directions. If both partners are in similar situations, there may not be much point to it, especially in the United States, as most assets would be considered community property. Story 58. A marriage certificate is a legal document. If you intend to establish a contract for your relationship, it is important to create one that protects the interests of both parties. Personally, I prefer to keep the government out of my relationships. Story 59. It depends on the situation. In instances where there is a significant wealth gap prior to marriage, a prenuptial agreement is practical. If there is no wealth or income gap, it may indicate bad faith. It can also be a response to dishonest behavior in a relationship. I once dated someone who lied, manipulated, cheated, and refused to work. After her deceitful behavior came to light, I countered her demands to get engaged with a requirement for a prenuptial agreement, which infuriated her because her intentions were to control me and receive financial support without responsibilities or obligations. When she became bored, she planned to seek a divorce and request alimony. Story 60. It's not a choice in my family. When there is family wealth, it is just a requirement and not open for discussion. Story 61. It is not a sign of distrust. It is practical and a great way to start a marriage. Many people mistakenly believe that a prenuptial agreement is a pre-made document that keeps assets separate. This is not true. A prenuptial agreement is created by you and your partner and can include any terms you both desire. The difference is whether you allow the government to determine asset distribution or if you and your partner make that decision together. Story 62. It makes sense for people who meet later in life. If we divorce, I will keep everything I had before we met. We can split anything we make together. She takes my money when I am in need. Yes, she is a trifling friend indeed. Oh, she is a gold digger living far away who takes advantage of me. Story 63. I believe it is acceptable, provided both parties are willing, not coerced, and represented by a competent attorney. Story 64. I believe that if a couple loves each other, they should want to protect one another, even from the changes within themselves. A fair prenuptial agreement will protect both parties and ensure an equitable division of assets. Decisions should be made to safeguard one party, especially if they plan to have children and one partner becomes a stay-at-home parent. Story 65. Practical decision. Honestly, I wouldn't mind if my future wife got one and actually expect it. Who knows how the relationship may evolve down the line. God forbid nothing goes sour, but sometimes things happen and people change without warning. Story 66. It entirely depends on the circumstances. I would never have signed a prenuptial agreement in my situation, and my husband would never have asked for one. We have been together since our early 20s, brought no assets to the marriage, and completely built our lives together. I supported us while he was finishing school, but my career took a back seat for several years during pregnancies and our children's younger years. We have always shared finances, regardless of who was contributing more at the time. I believe people who marry later have significant assets, and perhaps children from previous partners have a different set of circumstances to consider, and a prenuptial agreement in that situation likely makes sense. Story 67. It can avoid situations like this. Each person should have their own separate attorney review it to ensure it protects their interests. Story 68. I think it is wise to protect any wealth you earned before the marriage, including family assets you may inherit. Story 69. I view it as insurance. I do not have much to my name, but sharing accounts and assets would be difficult to divide during a divorce without it. Story 70. Marriage is a contract. You can have a wonderful, loyal, and thriving relationship without legal marriage. Entering into a marriage is simply formalizing that contract. There is nothing wrong with having a plan in place should it not work out. Many people get married with the best intentions, only to discover after 20 years that it has gone poorly. Consider a prenuptial agreement. Story 71. I think it is both a smart decision and a sign of distrust. It makes me happier than ever that nobody has loved me enough to want to marry me because much of marriage seems to be a situation where you cannot win. Story 72. Common sense suggests that you should protect the assets you have acquired for yourself. If she is unwilling to sign, she may not be the right person for you. Story 73. Only if one of us has real family money involved. I understand the need for protection. However, we are a team and share a life together. Fortunately, my husband felt the same way. We did not sign a prenuptial agreement, and after 10 years, we are still going strong, so this is merely an abstract thought experiment for me. Story 74. Get a prenuptial agreement so you won't have to argue when things go wrong. It's painful enough to break up without adding contractual disputes. It breaks people. For example, a friend of mine used a mediator for her prenuptial agreement so they would never go to court. Lawyers will say you can't do this, but you can. When her husband lost his temper and threatened to take her to court for divorce during a severe manic episode, guess who didn't have to worry? It was the woman who had prepared, even though she didn't know she had married someone with severe mental illness. They are still married. That's life. Story 75. Practical and, most importantly, a reasonable decision. For me, this is one of those topics that is not or should not be a point of contention for any reasonable person. A prenuptial agreement should be the standard way to handle these matters. People who argue otherwise seek a legal way to access wealth they did not earn. I am comfortable in life, not rich by any means, but I have enough to not worry about my next few paychecks. I had to work hard to reach my position and to have what I possess. Why should a partner have a legal right to half my wealth if we eventually decide it's best to part ways? That doesn't make sense to me. Likewise, if I find a partner who earns more than I do or has substantial wealth, and they suggest a prenuptial agreement, I will absolutely say yes, of course. I will be with them for who they are, for us as a couple, not for their money. So that is absolutely not an issue for me. Story 76. I signed a contract with my ex because he was wealthier than I was. It took some negotiation because he wanted me to change my last name to his, and I told him I would only sign if he changed his last name to mine. He promptly stopped discussing the name change. I signed the document. Now I am divorced. It was easy. I would definitely sign another one. Story 77. Often, prenuptial agreements tend to phase out over time. I see that as a positive aspect, honestly. If you're married for more than 10 years, then a spouse should receive something, but for someone who plans to leave within 12 months, that is not acceptable. Story 78. I am a family lawyer and a strong advocate for prenuptial agreements. My argument for them is straightforward. A prenuptial agreement requires you and your partner to sit down and discuss how you will manage property and finances at the beginning of the relationship rather than addressing these matters impulsively, often during emotional conflicts. A prenuptial agreement does not only address what happens if you separate, it also outlines how you will conduct yourselves during the relationship. Additionally, if you are entering into a second marriage, Especially if you already have children, prenuptial agreements are essential. In blended families, it is important to ensure that separate property remains separate as an estate planning measure so that your children benefit from your estate rather than your partner. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that I have many repeat clients, but I have not had a single repeat client as a result of drafting a prenuptial agreement. Interpret that as you wish. Story 79. I probably shouldn't, but here it goes. I married a wealthy woman. I didn't want to sign a prenuptial agreement. There were all kinds of moral dilemmas involved. It basically stated that if we separated, there would be no child support, alimony, division of assets brought into the marriage, or transfer of assets in any manner, and that this process legally begins if one of us becomes separated. Strangely, the state we were in requires a year of separation before granting a divorce. Essentially, we would need to jointly agree on how to part ways and what the settlement arrangements would be in the event of separation. This includes decisions about who moves out, who takes care of the child, who has custody, and all the other details that go into the transition from marriage to co-parenting. I hated it. I felt pressured to sign to quiet my mother-in-law and appease my father-in-law, who also wanted to silence her. Here's the kicker. It was crafted to protect my wife as it was believed that I was a freeloader marrying for money. My modest upper-middle-class upbringing was considered inferior to the lifestyle they were accustomed to. Keep in mind, her mother grew up in a trailer and married her provider at 14. They are prime examples of individuals who believe they are superior to their peers due to the efforts and sacrifices of their fathers. So we hit rough waters, and I started consulting attorneys to figure out how best to protect my daughter. My wife, who has nearly exhausted her trust fund and has relied on my salary for 2 decades, struggles with bipolar disorder and alcoholism. She has significant issues, which I might not have pursued had I been stronger and more self-assured 20 years ago. Nevertheless, she is the love of my life. That document I signed, intended to protect her, may ultimately end up favoring me if our marriage doesn't survive. In the end, you really never know. Perhaps the universe is urging you to sign and hope for the best. Story 80. For the last 100 to even thousands of years, it was customary for a woman and her family to bring something land, wealth, or goods into a marriage. Back then, what you owned before stayed yours, and only what you built together was shared. If it ended, she took her contribution back, not half of his premarital assets. That balance kept things fair, unlike today's courts that often do the opposite. If ever asked about marriage, just say, "Yes, I'd like to get married someday. I think it should be fair. Everyone brings what they've got, keeps it, and we split what we make together. That's how it's worked forever." Story 81. Anyone who has a problem with a prenuptial agreement is likely one of the following: childish, irrational, or has ulterior motives. There are no rational reasons to be against a prenuptial agreement. Story 82. It is an implicit sign of distrust and is one of the factors, such as not combining bank accounts, that contributes to a higher likelihood of divorce. Story 83. You would not give this a second thought if you had been taken advantage of twice without a prenup in place. Story 84. Personally, I see it as mistrust, and it should be treated as an indicator of at least one partner's poor quality. However, the world is a complicated place, and marriage is not just one singular idea. Some people treat it like a contract or partnership in a more literal sense, and that is fine. Marriage doesn't always have to be, and really isn't always, for love. Story 85. If you need a prenuptial agreement, I don't think you trust the person you are marrying. I would reconsider the decision. I have been with my partner for over 20 years and married for 9. We laughed when people asked if we would get a prenuptial agreement. Story 86. I think it's a good idea, and my husband and I were going to sign one but lost track of time and forgot to do it. Story 87. Given no other information, it is merely practical. Such an agreement means defining various terms while the relevant parties are in an amicable mood, which means that any future dissolution of the marriage can be transformed from something that could be nightmarish to mercifully straightforward. Story 88. I see it as a neutral and beneficial choice. The law already dictates the distribution of assets in a divorce. A prenuptial agreement allows you to customize the legal framework to suit your situation. It is particularly useful if both partners expect to inherit a family home alongside siblings. You can choose to exclude those assets from any divorce settlement, ensuring that the failure of the marriage does not compel either family to sell the family home. Story 89. My opinions have changed. When I was younger, I saw it as a sign of distrust. However, after my ex-wife left me to pursue her dreams of being a groupie, I now fully support them. In the age of no-fault divorces, it is important to protect yourself. Story 90. I believe they should be mandatory. What other important legal contract is signed without people defining and understanding the terms? Story 91. My wife and I married when we were 29. We wouldn't consider it otherwise. The point of marriage is a lifelong commitment. If you approach marriage with the attitude of "this might not work out," it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Story 92. I wouldn't marry someone who didn't want to work. That is true security. Prenuptial agreements can be disregarded. Story 93. A significant sign of distrust in your partner indicates that you do not believe the relationship will endure. If you do not trust your partner enough to consider a prenuptial agreement, it is advisable not to get married. Story 94. It's a sign of distrust, but I still understand it. To be honest, I think many people struggle with choosing their spouse, so they might as well approach it that way, especially those who are statistically more likely to get divorced. Story 95. I see it as a sign of distrust, but my wife and I lived together for 5 years before we got married. If you tend to marry someone after dating for only a month or two, or if you haven't tried living together, you should definitely consider prenuptial agreements because you may not know each other well enough to guarantee anything. Honestly, why would you marry someone if you feel a prenuptial agreement is necessary in the first place? Story 96. Men should not marry without a prenuptial agreement. Do you want to find yourself in a sexless marriage where your spouse takes half of everything you have worked your whole life for? Don't do it. Nearly 70% of divorces are initiated by women. Story 97. Prenuptial agreements aren't worth the paper they are written on when you learn the loophole to get them thrown out easily. Story 98. If there are significant assets involved, then it is a reasonable idea. Otherwise, there is not much point. It should not be seen as a sign of distrust because people change over time. Some individuals simply fall out of love or encounter a hurdle that they cannot overcome. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.